So the Japanese had already produced enough bombs, and the reason that this is pertinent is because when Einstein had basically come up with the equation for E equals mc squared, the Americans did not take him seriously because of their science advisor Enrico Fermi. Enrico Fermi was the science advisor to the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he was so conservative that he disputed the use or the exploitation of that equation. So he told the U.S. government that E equals mc squared might lead to the release of a large amount of energy, but it could not be utilized to make a weapon or an energy plant for at least a century. And because of his conservative attitude, Einstein, even when he immigrated to the United States, was not taken seriously. Oftentimes, much of the correspondence that I saw dismissed Einstein and fellow Jewish immigrant scientists as hysterical Jews. It was only with his insistence, with the gathering of many petitions from fellow physicists, that he was able to convince Roosevelt to start the Manhattan Project as an afterthought. America started very late in the war concerning the Manhattan Project, and Germany and Japan had been working on nuclear weapons for quite some time. In terms of the Germans, they were so rich in plutonium, they were so rich in uranium, rather, that they were able to ship large amounts to Japan via U-boats. Indeed, some of these U-boats were interdicted and captured by the United States. So the U.S. knew that this shipment of bombs, of bomb-making materials, fissionables, was going to Japan. Since Japan had its plants in terms of heavy water plants to process these materials up in northern Korea, it was ultimately the Russian invasion of North Korea which gave the Russians those materials in a regional sense that led to Eisenhower backing down from all-out invasion during the Korean War. And all of the North Korean materials that we hear about today, the plants in which they are refining various materials for bombs, they are basically improvements on those same Japanese plants that were left in North Korea at the end of 1945. All of those were the basic plants that were left behind when the Soviets invaded. The Soviets were able to get many Japanese scientists. They were able to start a regional atomic bomb building program. The North Koreans have used technology exchange to improve on that ever since. This is still a relic of that war. But atomic bombs had already been manufactured. Since they had had such a head start on the United States, as had the Germans, the Japanese were able to utilize the Sentoku submarines, the I-400s, in a strategic sense. The seaplanes on those submarines were able to carry an atomic bomb, which is a smaller model than what the Americans had. So what you had was the I-400 and the I-401 and the I-403 put out to sea, one to hit the East Coast, one to hit the West Coast, one to hit the Panama Canal. There was an I-404 which remained at sea long after the war ended, and an I-403. In terms of the I-400 and the I-401, they were surrendered by Emperor Hirohito in 1945 for the Americans to examine to prove his threat. And at that time, they were sailed by American prize crews to the American West Coast, where they were thoroughly studied and then scuttled. The I-402 was later on captured by the Americans, and it was sailed to Goto Island in the West Pacific, where it was also scuttled off of Goto Island with its 30 accompanying submarines. So what was left was the I-403 and the I-404, which were out at sea for many years. These were indeed rogue elements, and they were Emperor Hirohito's insurance policy. They were why he stayed on the throne, one of the reasons why the Americans helped to rebuild Japanese industry. What makes this important is, the final point is that while America had all of these troops isolated on the Japanese home islands, scattered all over the Pacific fighting the Japanese, is that at any time, aside from the gondolas that I spoke of, which would distribute biocidal weapons, the Japanese were willing to nuke specifically the Panama Canal. And had they done so, then all of the shipments to the Pacific Front are cut off. And basically, if they were to use the gondolas, and this is what Harry Truman was presented with, if they were using the gondolas in the military sense that I described earlier, then basically they would have saturated all of the United States with a biocidal weapons infection that would have forced quarantine of the entire western United States. This would have enabled all of these ports to have been blocked off for any real productive berthing of any American ships. You wouldn't be able to resupply through the Panama Canal, and the entire Pacific Front is left stranded and high and dry to be assaulted by the multi-million man army that the Japanese were mobilizing in China. This is the nightmare with which Truman ultimately acquiesced to in terms of bringing the war to an end. That the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped, which were considered simply conventional fire bombs of a higher order that happened to produce radioactivity, had been dropped simultaneous to that negotiation of peace, is something that he was able to use to his advantage by just telling the American people it was the bombs. In terms of what the Japanese suffered from those bomb effects, if you ask any Japanese children in the modern generation about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they will simply say, "What's Hiroshima? What's Nagasaki?" There is no impact on the memory of Japan of this tremendous devastation. However, what the Americans were faced with was this. And this I have actually illustrated myself. I drew this earlier today from memories of what I saw 20 years ago. So there may be some inaccuracies. There may be some mistakes. This is the military gondola which the Americans were facing. Emperor Hirohito made sure that several of these were sailed into American hands. By that I mean flown across the Pacific on a triple dirigible system. I am not an engineer, so I draw this out of visual memory. The important things that I do remember is that American engineers referred to it as a biomorphic design. It's important to remember Emperor Hirohito was a marine biologist. He made sure that this was a combination of millennia-old Japanese kite technology with the German Horten parabola and the flying wing. Now, as far as I can remember, even though it was a glider that was a gondola on the bottom of a triple dirigible system, the glider itself had some form of very short bursts of propulsion to take it into its final death dive across the United States. Here I've illustrated it the way the Americans would have seen it on the ground, with the bomb bay open, so that the ampules and the distribution of the Japanese biocidal weapons designed by Emperor Hirohito himself through Unit 731 in Harbin, China, and various other labs in Manchuria would be saturating in terms of the public below. So with these bomb bays open, the dropping of many ampules over large distances, probably selectively over cities as it went into its final dive, this weapon was formidable indeed, because no one inside of this weapon expected to come back. As a matter of fact, all of the crews that were ordered to surrender to the United States by the Emperor, and it was suspected, in the documents I saw, were ordered to commit suicide at the first possible opportunity. All of these crews served their function in helping Japan to achieve a victory by cessation of American hostilities. And in terms of what we see here, I purposefully moved this up. This was actually the gondola's attachment to the triple dirigible blimp system. If I had left it back further on the spine, you wouldn't be able to see it from this angle. So this is not fully accurate in terms of a technical presentation. In terms of the output for whatever sort of propulsion that it had for the short bursts, I believe it was some kind of synthetic fuel. As a matter of fact, I'm sure it was. Not being an engineer, the various terms actually escape me. Perhaps I can remember them with some suggestions. In terms of anything else that comes to mind, the stabilizer tail had an appendix on the end of it, which engineers referred to as a trellic system. I'm not quite sure what was meant by that. It was the visual impact of the military